from all of the possibilities. Now, the primary job of the action invoker is to select that appropriate action method. So it really can be more complicated than it might appear. There could be, as I mentioned, multiple overloaded methods with the same name. Those various overloaded methods could be decorated with attributes that control its use. In which case, their selection, or the selection of an action method that is decorated with a particular attribute, may mean that that particular version of the action method is appropriate in some scenarios, but not others. And furthermore, an action name may be different from the method name. And there's lots of other kinds of complications. So designing an effective controller requires that you understand how the selection process works. The first thing that the action invoker does is to look for the action portion of the route definition for the request. It does this using the default route defined in a new MVC application in the form shown here of controller, action, and ID. But you can define other forms of the routing. So it's looking for the action parameter. But even if the current URL doesn't include that action portion of the URL, then the default route definition defines it to be the index action. And then, once the action invoker has the name of the action, it needs to map that action name to a method of the controller. The simplest case occurs when there is a single method in the controller class with a name that matches the action name. For example, in a brand new MVC application, the index action of the home controller maps to the index method in that controller. There's only one index method within that controller class. But what qualifies as an action method? Is every method defined in the controller a potential action method? Nope, not at all. There are a few requirements that a method must meet for the action invoker to consider it to be an action method candidate. The first one is that it must be public and not static or shared. It also cannot be a method defined on system.object or the controller base class. In other words, it must be defined within your custom controller object, not inherited from another object. So, for example, toString could not be an action method because it's defined on system.object. It also cannot be a special method, such as a constructor, property accessor, or event accessor. Finally, it also cannot have the non-action attribute decoration. This attribute is handy if you want to include a public method in a controller, but don't want to use it as an action method. Taking all of these restrictions into consideration, the action invoker uses a reflection to find all of the methods in the controller with the same action name as the action name specified in the URL and meets the above requirements. But here's where things get a little bit murkier. Through the use of attributes on those methods, there could be multiple methods with the same name, but the action name could be different from the method name. And there may be a selector attribute that restricts what requests an action method can respond to. This can create a bit of a gauntlet the action invoker has to navigate to find the correct action method. So next what we're going to do is explore those action method features a little bit. But be aware that by default, anyone anywhere across the internet, assuming this is a public internet site, anyone anywhere can invoke any public method you create in a controller, unless you decorate the method with the non-action attribute. Now that sounds a little bit scary, but most of the time you're only going to include action methods as public methods within the class. So it really isn't an issue. Just be aware of that little possibility. So one of the attributes that we need to talk about is action name. The normal convention is that the method name that you define in the controller is also the action name. This is generally what you should do because it keeps things simple and straightforward. But you can also give an action method a different action name. Keep in mind that the action invoker matches up the route action name with the method's action name, which may not be the same name as the method within the controller, which is a little bit confusing, but bear with me. We'll straighten it out. Now, why might you want to give a method a different action name? Well, one reason might be that you want to use an action name that's not a legal language method name, such as a keyword in C# or Visual Basic. Another reason is that you want to use an MVC component name as the action name, such as view, literally the name view, which would conflict with the view method of the controller object. Or maybe you want to use a different naming standard for action methods and controller methods. Now, none of these are things that you should do lightly, but it's good to have the flexibility when you need it. So let's take a look at an example to hopefully sort all this out. Let's say that you have a method defined in the home controller called getAuthor. So we have this action method here. It's in the home controller of the sample application. Obviously very simple. All it's doing is returning a string. So I'll go ahead and run the application. And click on the getAuthor link. As you can see, the format of the URL is home, the controller, and then the action method name, getAuthor, and it returns that string. But this looks a little bit funky. Let's say that we want the URL to be not home/getAuthor, but we want it to be home/author. But we want to leave the method name the same within the controller, for whatever reason. All you need to do is apply this action name attribute. I have it commented out there. What that's doing is it's telling MVC application to look at that getAuthor method as having an action name of author. So I'll save that change, run the application again, and what I'll do first is click on that same getAuthor link. And as you can see, now I get an HTTP 404 error because the getAuthor action method no longer exists. The action invoker went through its gauntlet of looking for the appropriate action method and didn't find anything called getAuthor. What I need to do instead is use this other link called authorAction, and now you can see that it's home/author, and now we got the response that we expected. So it's important to understand that the getAuthor method is now invisible to ASP.NET MVC. You can't use that action method name any longer. So I'll shut down the page, and we can come over to the Home Controller's index view here and see the action links that I used in order to present those on the page. The first one, this is the text getAuthor that displays the text on the page, and it calls the getAuthor action method of the home controller. But if I rename it, this is the text again that is displayed, but I have to use the author action name when I'm using that attribute because getAuthor no longer exists. Once the action invoker has identified all of the controller methods that match the desired action name, it examines the action method selector attributes of all the candidate methods. You can decorate a controller method with this attribute to control under what conditions a controller method should agree to handle a particular type of request. The attribute defines only a single method, isValid for request. The action invoker executes this method on each candidate action method. If the isValid for request returns false for a controller method, that method is removed from the list of candidate action methods. The ASP.NET MVC framework includes several implementations of the action method selector attribute. One is non-action attribute. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but a controller method with the non-action attribute is immediately removed from consideration. So that's how you can include public methods within this class for other uses, but it won't be usable as an action method. The accept verbs attribute is a little bit more interesting. It uses the HTTP verb of the current request to determine whether the method should handle the request. That means that you could have multiple overloaded methods in the controller class designed to respond to different HTTP verbs, such as get, post, delete, etc. It takes a single parameter with a list of HTTP verbs that the method will handle. But easier to use are some additional attributes that were introduced with MVC2. These derive from Action Method Selector attribute and include HTTP delete, HTTP get, HTTP post, and HTTP put. Each corresponds to a single HTTP verb and accepts no parameters. So let's see how this works. Here's the Action Controller class that was created as part of a new MVC web application. And it implements two versions of the register action method here. They're overloaded. One takes no parameters, and the other takes a register model parameter. Now this latter method is decorated with this HTTP post attribute, which means that this version of the action method is only going to handle requests that use the post verb. This other register method will handle requests that use any of the other HTTP verbs, and most commonly it's going to be the get verb. Because the way this works is this is the action method that originally presents the form to the user to register, and then this is the action method that is called in order to process the data that the user enters within that form. All right, so once the action invoker has run the complete gauntlet, it should have whittled down the list of candidate action methods to exactly one. If there still remains more than one candidate that can handle the request, then the action invoker throws an exception indicating that there's an ambiguous match. But if there's no method that can handle the request, the invoker is going to invoke the unknown action handler, which is actually the handle unknown action method of the controller class. By default, what this method does is it returns an HTTP 404 status code indicating that the resource was not found. But you can override the method and do whatever you want to in response. So let's take a look at the home controller. And here I've implemented that handle unknown action method. So let me remove the comments here. And that now makes it active. And all we're doing is we're just using response.write to write a string out to the page. I'll go ahead and run this. And I'm going to use this doesn't exist link here, which is going to attempt to go to the home/non-existent URL, literally non-existent action method. I'll do that. You can see the URL there, and it displays that string. Now, in a real-world application, you're probably going to want to redirect to some kind of error page, something more than just an ugly string that you present to the user. But you can basically do whatever you want within that handle unknown action method.